What do you think? Yeah, who has it? I think Ashley has it.
Hi, everyone.
Do you know if Ashley
Hi.
has it?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Hazel.
Do you know if Ashley has the orange song?
No, I am not sure.
All right.
Okay. So hi, everyone. I think we're streaming live on Facebook now. So if you are able to view me on Facebook, hi, everyone. We're encouraging you all to share the live. Join in on Zoom if you can. This is a webinar hosted by the CIWiLTT Trinidad and Tobago National Chapter, examining the role in ending gender-based violence. I think we have a good bit of people here. So yes, I think we have a good bit of people here. So welcome again, everyone. I didn't say who I am. My name is Jacquie Burgess, and I am the executive coordinator for the Trinidad and Tobago National Chapter. And we are very happy to have you here with us today. So what we're gonna do, we're just gonna go over to a short video on gender-based violence and 16 Days of Activism. And after the video, we'll come back to me, I'll redo my introduction, and then I will hand over to today's moderator. So get a glass of water, make yourself comfortable. We're gonna have a really engaging conversation.
In Latin America and the Caribbean, one woman is killed every 2 hours due to her gender. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated gender-based violence across the region.
I can't see anything.
In the audio just now, but no video.
In Latin America and the Caribbean, one woman is killed every 2 hours due to her gender. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated gender-based violence across the region. In Brazil, femicides increased 22% in between March and April in 12 Brazilian states compared to the same period last year. In El Salvador, a total of 71 femicides were reported between January and August. One woman is murdered by a man every 24 hours, making El Salvador the country with one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. In Mexico, 10 women are killed each day as a result of their gender, or 1 every 2.5 hours in the first semester of 2020, a 5% increase compared to the same period last year. While Mexico, El Salvador, and Brazil account for the majority of cases of gender-based violence in Latin America, women across the region are impacted by this crisis. Why is it that gender-based violence has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic? 7 out of 10 femicides in Latin America occur in a victim's home. Stay-at-home orders have further complicated this, leaving women with fewer options for escaping violence, with many living under the same roof as their abuser. Domestic violence hotlines have seen notable increases. In Colombia, there was a 225% increase in calls during just the first week of lockdown. During the first 3 months of quarantine in Peru, 915 women were reported missing by government authorities. This is significant considering 10% of the country's femicides in 2019 were first reported as disappearances. While 2020 was declared the year against femicide and infanticide in Bolivia, the government, who has already employed strict lockdown measures, has reported 83 femicides as of August. Moreover, many women's shelters across the region have shut down due to their inability to meet social distancing requirements. El Salvador repurposed Ciudad Mujer, the country's safe homes for women, as containment centers during the pandemic, and closed additional facilities due to lack of personnel and funding. In Mexico, funding for women's shelters was cut, despite a 20% increase in reports of violence. In Brazil, however, Casa de Mujeres Brasileiras remains open, providing a safe and sanitary haven for women during the pandemic. Services include support from social workers, psychologists, representatives from the Department of Justice and Family Court, hotlines, and nurseries. While justice for gender-based violence during the pandemic has varied throughout the region, governments are beginning to think creatively about how to support women at home. Public service campaigns that encourage the reporting of domestic violence, such as Argentina's #BarbijoRojo social media campaign, are helping alert leaders and law enforcement authorities about the scale of the problem. The Women's Division of Guatemala's Public Prosecutor's Office recently pledged to implement more programs and campaigns to help women on their path to justice, even given the global pandemic. President Luis Abinader of the Dominican Republic announced the creation of 12 new women's shelters and an $173 increase in subsidies that victims of domestic violence may receive to acquire housing away from their abusers. NGOs and international organizations are also working hard to address these challenges. The International Rescue Committee launched a humanitarian information platform, Cuéntanos, where users in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador can seek information for essential services, such as gender-based violence protection. In Venezuela, NGOs such as CEPAS, Funda Mujer, and Doctors Without Borders have created hotlines for victims to report abuse. And in Ecuador, a group of advocates created the No Mas campaign, an initiative that is designed to spread awareness of gender-based violence, facilitate communication between institutions and victims, and identify the action steps that can be taken if someone is experiencing violence. Gender-based violence continues to claim the lives of women at alarming rates across Latin America, and governments will have to continue tracking and evaluating comprehensive policy solutions for this critical problem, particularly as they continue to brace the impacts of COVID-19. To learn more, check out the Wilson Center's ongoing coverage of gender-based violence in Latin America at gbv.wilsoncenter.org.
Thank you very much for that video. Again, to everyone who was not here before, my name is Jacquie Burgess, and I am the Executive Committee Coordinator of the CIWiLTT Trinidad and Tobago National Chapter Executive. Welcome to all of you all. Welcome to this webinar on gender-based violence, and more specifically, my role in ending gender-based violence. We encourage you to share the live or link with your networks as we prepare for an urgent and very timely discussion on ending gender-based violence. In commemoration of 16 Days of Activism, the chapter found it necessary to host this webinar as we continue to see an increase in cases of violence against women and girls. Today, I have with me Jacquie Burgess, Dr. Angelique Nixon, and Asiya Mohammed, who will be our panelists, and Ashley Burnett, our moderator, and the chair of the Trinidad and Tobago National Chapter. So now I'll hand you over to Ashley as we begin today's discussion. Ashley?
Thank you so much, Carice. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar, where we will be discussing my role in ending gender-based violence. So I have the privilege of moderating this afternoon's discussion. And before we get there, I'm going to introduce to you our three amazing panelists, which you're very, very familiar with them and their work. So first up, there is Asiya Mohammed, and she's the founder and CEO of Conflict Women Limited, a social business committed to solving gender-based violence through entrepreneurship. Through its Butterfly project, Conflict Women provides training in business, jewelry making, and conflict transformation for rape and domestic violence survivors. Through its survivor pitch competition, survivors can access capital to invest in their small businesses as well as mentorship. Asiya is the recipient of the 100th Commonwealth Point of Light Award from Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, and of a National Medal for the Development of Women Gold from the President of Trinidad and Tobago. She serves as an advisory member of UNIDAS, the Women Network connecting Latin America, the Caribbean, and Germany, convened by the German Foreign Ministry, and as a member of the President's Leadership Council of Search for Common Ground. Welcome, Asiya. Next up, we have Jacquie Burgess, which is home to CIWiLTT, which serves as our treasurer. Jacquie has been part of the women's movement for approximately 40 years. She describes herself as a feminist activist. When the history of the women's movement is written, she'll be somewhere in there, having done her activism in groups such as Concerned Women for Progress, the group Working Women, which she's the co-founder of, Rape Crisis Society TNT, Millennium Sisters TNT, and the regional organization Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action, CAFRA. Among her qualifications, she holds a BSc in Sociology and an MSc in Gender and Development Studies. Welcome, Jacquie.
Thank you.
Next up, and our final panelist, but definitely not least, is Dr. Angelique Nixon. Dr. Nixon is a Bahamas-born and raised Trinidad-based writer, artist, teacher, scholar, and activist. She is a lecturer and researcher at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the UWI St. Augustine campus, where she also leads a human rights activity-based project called Sexual Culture of Justice, working to end gender-based violence and LGBTI discrimination by transforming harmful gender and sexual norms. Angelique is also the director on the working board of CIWiLTT, Sex and Gender Justice in Trinidad and Tobago. She is the author of the poetry and art chapbook titled Saltwater Healing, a myth memoir and poems, and the scholarly award-winning book titled Resisting Paradise, Tourism, Diaspora, and Sexuality in Caribbean Culture. Angelique is fiercely committed to intersectional queer feminist praxis, decolonial politics, and Black liberation. Through activism, writing, and art, Angelique strives to disrupt silences, affirm healing, and carve spaces for resistance and desire. A huge welcome to Dr. Nixon and to all of our panelists this evening. So we have presentations that will flow. Jacquie, Dr. Nixon, and Asiya Mohammed. The floor is yours.
Okay, so I want to thank CIWiL for including me in this exercise here this afternoon into evening. I just want to start with our kind of realizing or just taking a look at the culture of violence in Trinidad and Tobago, and more so the violence against women. We have been talking for years about violence against women. We have been trying all sorts of things, things on the ground, to legislation, of how can we address domestic violence. And it seems like every time you think you're making an impact, it flares up again and you have to start again from ground zero. A number of women are hurting. I mean, for the last week, the country has been topsy-turvy. I think everybody had something to say about the last killings. And we just can't go on that way. We just have to do something. Something has to be done. We have to reach a point where we could say, I mean, some people say it could never be eliminated, but let's get as close as possible to elimination as we can. We have to continue pressing. We have to continue working at it. We have to get everybody who has a part to play to do their part in addressing the situation. Otherwise, what will happen? We're going to be happening with our girls. We're going to be happening with our children. How would they know that there is another way to live? We just can't. I mean, not to use the man song, we just can't go on this way. But we really cannot continue as we are. And that's my opening salvo.
You want me to just dive in, Ashley? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Well, I mean, Jackie, that's it right there. It's, you know, in January, we started the year with a number of femicides and murders at the hands or within homes and through domestic violence. We started with meetings with the police commissioner. We started with a petition. All of the women's organizations and human rights organizations, LGBT organizations came together and we said, we are demanding more. And so I think just as we started the year, we are closing out the year with these horrific acts of violence where we still have to hold our leaders accountable. And, you know, in January, we had these 6 demands where we said, you know, we want more state accountability. I think we need to revisit those demands and continue to push. The only one out of the 6 we've gotten from the state is the amendment to the Domestic Violence Act. And so I think we are in a state, and we need to call it a state of emergency. We are in the midst of a national crisis amidst a pandemic. And I think we need to call it out and say what it is. Given the last 2 weeks and the last month and the last year, I think there are no clear-cut answers. There's not one thing we need to do. We need to be working in multifaceted approaches. And we need to think about, I mean, today's topic, this idea of what is my role in ending GBV. I think a part of the problem is us working in silos. There's no silos here. We have to be thinking about it in a unified front and to acknowledge all of the work that organizations have been doing for decades and decades. And that work needs to be supported more and more. And for me, you know, I wanted to highlight the ways that we speak out, the ways that we continuously speak out about gender-based violence, the ways that we continuously put ourselves in these conversations and share our ideas. And that has to obviously continue. But what I think we need to also do is to, in the midst of these, of our outrage, of our sorrow, of our grief, I think we need to create even more spaces for us to, yes, come up with ideas. We had an amazing town hall. Womantra called a town hall a few days ago. Was that last weekend? The days are blurring. Last weekend. And, you know, so many people had different ideas, from state accountability to different kinds of programs to, you know, different kinds of trainings and all of that. All of the ideas were amazing. And so I'm really curious to hear what people are thinking about, what ideas people have. And I want to call on us to continue to hold the state accountable and responsible, and to continue pushing for more resources to go to the gender-based violence unit. That was one of our demands. We need to continue to push for more resources to go to the women's organizations, shelters, and different groups, community-based groups, who are doing the work to help support survivors. All of that needs to continue happening. And most of all, for me, I think what's important is that we are in a crisis where we need to think about how do we change and transform our cultural norms, our attitudes and behaviors around gender-based violence. For me, we keep putting band-aids on the problem, and we need to figure out how do we transform our entire system. So we need to start with, of course, we've been talking about this, start with the school system. The school system needs transformation. We need GBV training for our teachers, for administrators, for the students, age-appropriate, comprehensive sex education that empowers young people about their bodies, that helps young people understand themselves. Both girls and boys and all children need this knowledge. We also need help and support for parents. We also need to push against this idea that we can't talk about and think about sex with young people. We absolutely need to. The studies all show it decreases child sexual abuse, and it increases conversations and understandings about consent and about the body, and it decreases gender-based violence later on and empowers young people to make different kinds of choices. We need that. We also need to talk and have deep, serious conversations with institutions and first responders. What I have seen in the last week from our leaders is a lot of victim blaming. I think that is a serious concern and issue. We cannot have our leaders and major leaders within the GBV unit up to the Prime Minister saying things like women need to be more careful, women don't smile, women don't be on your social media when you're trying to get public transport. I don't understand what the last week, my brain has exploded with the amount of victim blaming and the amount of pressure on women and girls to quote unquote be responsible for themselves. I have seen some calling out of men don't rape, men don't assault, but mostly it's in response to the victim blaming. I haven't seen that coming from leaders. And so when we talk about our role in ending GBV, I think we all need to step up. We all need to have these conversations. And I think most of all, the state, our institutions, our first responders, and everyone within communities, we all need to hold each other accountable around how we want to end and transform and stop gender-based violence, which means getting at the root cause of the issues. I'll pause there and share more in a little bit. Thank you, Ashley. Oh, Asiya, I'm passing it over to you.
Okay. Can you all hear me now? Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Angelique, for that wonderful Passover. Just sitting here and listening to you speak, Angelique, and listening to Jacquie speak, and having Auntie Hazel Brown, on the call with us this evening. It just makes me reflect in terms of how fortunate I am to be part of the women's movement in Trinidad and Tobago. How blessed I feel to be surrounded by such strong women who don't just sit down and accept things, but who have always taught me to challenge, and who have challenged the status quo for many, many years. I think I want to echo a lot of what both Jacquie and Angelique just said. And I also want to echo the pain and outrage that many of us in the women's movement feel. This week, the week before, have been extremely difficult for a lot of us. Many of us, every single day, we've been doing, if not 1, 2 interviews. We've been on virtual panels, we've been engaged in activities, we've been doing and doing and doing. And it's been so much, it's been a lot. As I had said in a previous interview, our femicide count for this year is up to 21 with Ashanti Riley, which is completely unacceptable. And I think when we talk a little bit about my role in ending gender-based violence, I think that's where it has to come into play. So I'll just share a little bit. Before I founded Conflict Women in 2014, I was at the Foreign Ministry, and I'm more sharing this for the people who are not familiar with that story or that chapter in my life. I was with the Foreign Ministry working in the UN, the multilateral division, covering gender and human rights at the UN. And I felt like every time we spoke about policies, as important as it was, Yes, Angelique, you're correct. The total number of women is 45 and 2 girls. And within that, the femicides are 21. So those killed directly as a result of GBV. Yeah. Thanks for that, Angelique. Yeah. And I just got quite frustrated with trying to drive the change at the policy level. So whether I was in New York at the UN or in Port of Spain at the Foreign Ministry and working on resolutions, working on country reports for Trinidad and Tobago, on CIWiLTT, a convention to eliminate discrimination against women, or on the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review. And when you open the paper, another woman is murdered or another domestic violence case or assault has happened. And I just got so frustrated and so fed up with it, which is what I think many people on this call can, you empathize, you obviously feel the same way. And I really felt like I needed to go back to the grassroots. So I wanted to just work directly with survivors. I felt like I was waiting for the states, I was waiting for policy, and I was waiting too long. And I felt like I was just drowning. So as much as I love that work and I thought, okay, it's important, I wanted to go where I could effect the most change. And that was actually in the grassroots, working directly with survivors. And that's how Conflict Women was born. And I think every day since then, every week since then, every month since then, I relish in the fact that I can wake up and just change a life, right? Because I think that's where it begins. I think that's where the change happens. So for me, what has helped in terms of myself is actually finding tangible actions that I can take to support women like my mother, to support survivors who are in abuse now, who do not have the time to wait for the state to change its policies, to wait for the state to get its act together, right? They're in abuse now. And I want to echo on that note, since we're talking about policy a little bit, I want to echo what Angelique said. The victim blaming has to end. It is not sufficient for our head of government to stand up and say to women, you have to protect yourself. You have to stay safe after another murder. We need to move beyond that. We need to start speaking to men. What is their role? We need to call emergency meetings as to why we still do not have a national gender policy. We need to really look at why since 2016 and after so many women and girls have been murdered since gender-based violence, we still do not have a national strategic action plan to end gender-based violence. So not to get into it too much, but just to say, for me, where I found myself and where I found my balance is to continue the advocacy and continue the lobbying in terms of lobbying government, lobbying states, etc., but also in finding a balance with doing the work on a day-to-day basis with survivors of rape, with survivors of domestic violence, and really helping them and really supporting them in their journeys and changing the outcomes of their personal situation. And that's where I've sort of found my peace in the middle of this massive conflict that is gender-based violence. Thanks. Ashley, over to you.
Thank you so much to everyone who presented. I love how human this felt and how we were able to share in that community and learn things in the simplest and most applicable ways. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm pretty sure our audience is privileged and happy to be a part of this conversation. Just a reminder, before we get into the discussion, for all our viewers to send your questions, send your comments, and join in this conversation with us. So coming out of the presentations, I think it's perfect to start off with this question in asking, how do we get persons to really understand and learn that gender-based violence isn't just a woman's issue, but it's a human rights issue? What do you think are some ways that persons can be able to learn about that and have an understanding for all panelists?
I guess I can jump in. I mean, I think that people understand and experience, sorry, excuse me. So many people are survivors. and have experienced violence in their homes. So, sorry, my throat. I think a part of the challenge in raising it as a human rights issue is to offer space for people to think through and talk about the ways that we've normalized violence. Family violence, violence against children, these things are normalized. And I think that's a part of the challenge in really being able to talk about how do we understand gender-based violence, and also understanding different forms of violence and how they all contribute to and intersect with gender-based violence. Like, one of the challenges in LGBT work is being able to talk about how gender-based violence includes violence against people based on their sex and gender identity, sexual orientation, gender presentation. And so a part of it is being able to have these conversations about intersectional violence, and also to talk about how things impact us in different ways. And I think it's also really important for us to always contextualize that we are born out of our region, our world is born out of colonial violence. It's born out of so much racial and economic and social different forms of violence. And so we have to also be willing to have those conversations. So we're not talking about things just in one way. And that's how I think you get to that point where you're raising Ashley, which is to say that gender-based violence is a human rights issue.
Thanks, and Angelique, I thought that was really, really important. I think for me, I think what has to happen is a lot of people know violence and or experience violence, but they may not be familiar with some of the terminology that we use, right? So I think within the women's movement, we say GBV all the time. Now, I mean, an average member of the public has no clue what GBV is. So I was on, I think it was a television interview recently, and you know, the TV presenter asked me, can I define what is GBV, and can I define, sorry, what is gender-based violence, and can I define what is femicide? So I think we need to do a lot of education around human rights so that everyone understands, starting from a very young age, starting from our children in school, letting them know as children, you have rights. And those rights are enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was signed and ratified by your government, by your country. Right. So I think that sort of education from an early age needs to happen, because I remember being 21 and a friend said to me, oh, her specialization in international relations was human rights. And I looked at her, and I was also studying IR at the time. I was a freshman, no, sorry, sophomore. And I said to her, what is human rights? Like, what are you talking about? What are you studying? Right. So even like that, and I just say that to say that 21-year-old Asiya, even doing an international relations degree, I had just started, I was in my second year, and you know, in terms of that terminology, but when you talk about, are you experiencing sexual violence? Are you seeing beatings or assault between your parents at home? You know, can you not afford proper shelter or accommodation? I think that is where the conversation has to start, because all those things are interconnected with our experience of either having our human rights met and protected or not having our human rights protected. And just to say that women's rights are a huge part of human rights. Yeah, thanks.
And I'll just follow on that, because we always say women's rights are human rights. And when we look at it, the right to life, which most of these women have to forego because they're killed, is a fundamental right that we all have, the right to protection. And if you're not protected from the people who you think you love or you thought love you, then what are we doing? People have to understand or get it, make that connection. And I'm talking of all people have rights, but in our case and what we are discussing here, a woman's rights are human rights, and every day is being violated. Every second. You heard those staggering statistics earlier, albeit not from in our part of the world, but it could very well be. We have to understand that everybody has a right to be here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Oh, Jacquie, sorry.
Oh, yes, well, I was just saying that I'm done, so you can take over.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And, listening to everyone's contribution, the underlying thing and the common, suggestion there is education. They need people to really understand the root of different things and to make things accessible. Because sometimes the terminology, people want to learn, but sometimes the resources are hard to access, or the terminology is just something that it's not, that accessible or for anyone really, like the average person to understand. And so thank you so much for that. So I know the government, and I think this is a rhetorical question, but you're free to answer, and it's something that I'm pretty sure we all know the answer to. But do you think there's enough pressure on the state to fulfill its human rights obligations? Because we've signed on to several things, right, as a country. But do you think there's enough pressure placed on them? Do you think the population of Trinidad and Tobago are holding them accountable and doing enough to really push for that to be implemented?
I would think in the first place, many people do not know that some of these things exist. So they cannot bring the pressure to bear on the government. So whether they do it or they didn't do it, they could go away scot-free because nobody can hold them up. If you're talking about CIDO, if you're talking about the rights of the child, a number of people might hear it in passing and not know what it means. And so they don't even know, like when the government presents and they have things to come back and do, they don't have that information, so they can put pressure on the government, but the government had to take stock. The government know what they're supposed to be doing, and they should be pressuring themselves that the next time they go to report, that they should be reporting something improved and not they don't have anything to report, or they just didn't do what they were asked to do.
Well, here's what I'll add to that, Ashley. So next year is going to be a really interesting year, right? Because it's 2021. And not just that there's something interesting with the digits 2021, but more than that. Our report for CIDO, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, was actually due to the UN this year. And because of COVID, it's been delayed. So it's going to be due next year. And that is actually, it means that our CIDO report is now going to become due in the same year as our Universal Periodic Review to the United Nations. And so not to confuse anyone, but the United Nations convenes the Human Rights Council, and countries come in front of the Human Rights Council and they defend their human rights record every 4 years. At the same time, civil society is allowed to prepare a shadow report, because we know that governments will like to look good. And I've been very fortunate to be in Geneva when several other countries, not Trinidad and Tobago, but several other countries presented a Universal Periodic Review, and also to assist and edit and work on this for our governments when I moved back to Trinidad and Tobago. So we are going to come under pressure from the UN, but just to say, one of my biggest challenges with the UPR and the CIDO report is in terms of enforcement, right? So we know a lot of the committee members would make recommendations. And the last time, for example, in our 2016 UPR reports, I actually checked it. And 1 out of every 4 recommendations, so 25%, were related to violence against women. Right, so it's going to be a very interesting process next year. And I think it presents an opportune time for the women's movement, which sometimes does not receive the level of consideration that we should receive from government, to start lobbying specific to CEDAW and also to UPR, and to really come together and figure out what are we going to put into our shadow report, because we are going to be under the microscope in terms of the world, right? And in terms of the UN. Now, the other thing to that is, as citizens, I think we need to put a lot more pressure on government. And I also want to say that in international relations, when we study IR, you hear about the state-centric world, right? And since the time I studied and graduated with a bachelor's in IR and graduated with a master's in politics, the world has changed significantly. So the world, I would say, and I would offer to those listening today, is no longer state-centric. We've seen where big business, for example, sometimes bring in as much money as whole countries put together, right? So I think while we look at the state and while we put pressure on the state, we need to also look to businesses, right? We need to look to private, public sector partnerships. We need to shift our thinking, and we also need to look at innovative and creative approaches, right? And the final thing I'll say in answer to your question, Ashley, is we also need to look at who is experiencing gender-based violence and how. Ashanti Riley boarded a PH taxi, right? Is it that all girls who are going to board a PH taxi, who rely on public transportation, can now be threatened? Their safety is threatened? Because I see Sophia Alexander on this call this afternoon, and I was on a panel with her and some of her young friends, you know, and they are the same age as Ashanti. And she said to me, my friends and I, you know, we're scared. We're too scared to take public transportation. So I think we also need to look at some of the socioeconomic discrepancies that force people into situations where gender-based violence happen. If Ashanti was driving and had her own car, would she have taken public transportation? Right, so, okay, those are my answers. Sorry, that was a bit long, thanks.
Ashley, you want me to jump in?
Yes, please.
Well, I mean, just to build on what Jacquie and Asiya already said, yeah, we know that there needs to be more pressure, but it's also like, what is that pressure going to do? I think there's always a danger when we use the kind of UN conventions and treaties and obligations, then it becomes, oh, you know, we're sovereign, we're our own nation, you know. And so I think those things are very delicate. I think it's, you know, it's up to us, as Asiya said, to put pressure to not even, like, those conventions are great, but we have our own standards by which we want to see change. And I think making sure things are as local and relevant to our spaces, and this is for our, you know, lessons for across the region, that, you know, we need to make those demands really clear. But I do think that sometimes it can be useful and strategic, right? And Asiya's point about the shadow report coming up, and it's something for across human rights and my work in CIWiLTT, it's been a way for human rights organizations to come together and look at those intersections and build coalitions to say, we are going to make these demands and we're going to talk about these issues. And so I think it can be useful and strategic. But to your point, Asiya, about, you know, the issue of, you know, we have to be thinking about the various challenges that people are experiencing, social, economic, across the board. And, you know, another way for us to think about it, when we think about what happened to Ashanti Riley and the issue of the safety in public transport, that becomes a state issue. The state has an obligation to ensure that services, public services, are safe, and that women and girls and all people who use public services are safe. And I think, so if we can pivot the conversation to say, we demand that that there's more regulation, but not just that, because I think regulation provides its own, you know, complicated thing, but that the taxi drivers are getting some kind of training, right? That there's a demand for taxi drivers to get gender-based violence training. You know, one of the suggestions that Stephanie and Womantra, we discussed at the town hall last weekend, was around, let's work with the Trinidad and Tobago Taxi Association to figure out how do we create change at that level. And so I think we also need to have those kinds of conversations too, and push how we think about creating change. The Trinidad and Tobago Taxi Association came, I think they had a press conference, right? Did anyone see that? And so it's very clear too that they are invested in people feeling safe. They don't want women and girls to feel unsafe catching public transport. And so there's an opportunity there. And what I would have loved to see this week, if the gender-based violence unit was like, yes, we're partnering, we're going to make sure, and whoever wants to be involved, civil society, you've been doing this, come and partner with us, and let's make sure that our public transportation system is safe. I mean, yes, there's still going to be issues, but I'm just saying, like, wouldn't that have been a really remarkable opportunity and moment to do something like that? But, you know, we got victim blaming instead.
Thank you, everyone. And coming off on Angelique's last point, there is a huge disconnect amongst like, civil society and sometimes the state. We see things in a way that, because I guess we're on the ground, and that always seems to be at a disadvantage because you have to do extra work to get them on board. And I really hope that at some point there is unity there where the state actually have meaningful engagement with CSOs and not just say, hey, y'all, we're going to do some consultations. And then at the end of the consultation, that's it, because then things will never be done. So thank you so much. And Angelique, I actually have this question for you. How important are feminist principles in achieving a gender-based violence-free society?
Wow, you're gonna give me the hardest question. I mean, absolutely, of course, but then we have to also understand what feminist principles are, and I think that goes back to both what Jacquie and Asiya were talking about earlier. You know, when we talk about feminist principles, that could already alienate people. But when we talk about we want to live lives free of violence and coercion, we want to live lives that are filled with freedom and dignity. We want to live lives that are powerful and where we have healthy, loving relationships, and where our homes are not places where there's harm. So I think for me the question becomes, again, how are we talking about the gender norms and the sexual norms that are harmful and pervasive and that give rise to violence? Gender-based violence doesn't come out of nowhere, right? It comes out of, I think, generational trauma, I think genetic memory, I think so many ways that our societies have been harmed by colonialism and by other forms and structures of oppression. And so we can't battle gender-based violence just through feminist principles, although I do think that feminist principles, if we mean them to be, and we understand them to be, certainly intersectional, certainly around justice. I think gender justice is a paradigm that makes a lot, that makes the most, sort of resonates if we think about we don't want people to be discriminated on the basis of all of the things we don't want to be discriminated, against. But certainly when we think about the feminist principles of justice, of gender justice, of sexual justice, of reproductive health and rights, of being able to live freely and love freely, when we think about dealing with the injustices of the past, then absolutely. And what does that mean, though? It does mean, I think, a lot of transformation in how we understand and see ourselves. And for me, I go back to healing. I think we have a lot of healing work to do in our families and our societies. And we have to acknowledge that there's been a lot of harm, and we need that time in our organizations, in our institutions, in our schools, in our families, to think about how we work through that to get to this place of healing and of seeing ourselves. And one of the things that I learned in doing gender-based violence training with men in particular has been, how do we understand ourselves in relationship to others? And, I think that, when harm has been happening for so long and we're a part of it, sometimes we don't even see it. And, the kind of, in a way, it's we see it, those patterns that happen again and again. And so for me, when we think about transforming and recreating, I think we have to first start with a lot of healing, with a lot of open conversations, and we have to ensure that we're being inclusive in talking about these transformations and changes and getting different ideas, different understandings, and a kind of space where we can be open to talk about these issues. And then at the core of all of this for me is accountability. I think that we absolutely need principles of accountability. It is so hard to talk about when harm has happened, even in our families. And, you know, I've had some, as a survivor myself of child sexual abuse, I've come out and talked about, you know, how I don't think a sex offenders registry is of and in itself going to be helpful because folks who have done harm, especially in our families, we know them, right? And, you know, I don't think the criminal justice system is the place. And so I think there's so many things when we think about having a society or a world free of gender-based violence. There's so many things that are violent. Like, we can't just throw people in prison and in jail and expect that that's somehow going, like, more imprisonment and more incarceration, I don't think is going, more punitive measures is not going to give us that world free of gender-based violence. And so I'm very torn around how we get there, but I know that it is not in the punitive way. And I know that we absolutely need to come together and think through the various intersections of people's experiences. People are experiencing oppression in so many different ways, and we have to make those connections.
Wow. Thanks, Dr. Nixon. Wow. That last point, it's something that I struggle with, like, internally, with really trying to make sense of perpetrators when it comes to sexual abuse, and really, like, finding it in myself to just understand the many levels to it, and knowing that sometimes there isn't really a clear-cut way to deal with things. I mean, our past is embedded in violence, and we learn violence through our parents and our parents' parents who would have, you know, done things through violence. And so, as you rightfully said, there's so much healing for us to do to get to a point where we can actually figure out a way forward. I heard someone speak some time ago about, you know, the Caribbean is still finding its identity because we're still young in so many ways, and for most of the existence, it's, you've been told what to do. There was something for you to follow, and now with so many countries here being independent and being a republic, we're still finding our way and still finding how to heal and our identity. This other point that you made, if feminist principles are actually done right, and that is something that I like resonated so much with me. I always get annoyed with myself for saying intersectional feminism, because I'm like, feminism should be intersectional. But of course, there are people who have their brand of feminism that's not intersectional at all. It's for only one type of woman, like the working persons who are working, probably white Trinidadians who are driving really nice cars and are CEOs, and that independence. So you raise so many great points, and I'm sure that people on here and even our panelists and everyone that's tuned in, we're really, really happy to hear that, and, you know that the things that we're also struggling with has been validated, even though it may not need to be validated, but just knowing that, you know, it's not, we're not alone. Is there any panelists that would like to chime in on that point?
Yeah, just to say, Angelique raises some very critical issues there. You know, I'm a fan of restorative justice. I saw also that Sophia just asked a question, you know, around the idea of restorative justice. Can it work with perpetrators? Can it not? Right? And unfortunately, while I've studied it, and I'm fortunate to have consulted in this area on alternative dispute resolution in Central Africa. There we use the principle, but we did not use it for criminal offenses, right? So we were able to use mediation and arbitration more for civil offenses as opposed to penal. Okay, Angelique, you're saying, I think it can, but it needs to be done really well and be engaged with community and survivors. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, the projects I worked on, we've used alternative dispute resolution, but as I said, for civil, not criminal offenses, right? Now, that being said, for me, even founding Conflict Women, I had to go through this whole process of forgiveness of my father, who was the perpetrator within our family, right? And I've worked with a lot of survivors, and I remember our first survivor. I always remember what she said. She experienced child sexual abuse when she was younger, and then went on into a relationship with her partner where she was for many, many years a survivor of domestic violence, right? And she said to me, she said, you know, it took her years and years and years before she could actually forgive all the perpetrators, from the person who had molested her when she was a child, to move through that journey to her partner, who was also father of their child, their daughter. And she said something really incredible. She said, when you forgive, you take your power back. And I think I'll just let those words sink in. When you forgive, you take your power back. I've spent a long time studying how we transform conflict, whether it's possible, what it requires. It's an extremely challenging process. Sometimes it takes decades. It could also be a very painful process, right? And I think what I would say to any survivors on this call today is focus on yourself, focus on your individual recovery, make sure that you are okay, and then the rest will come, right? So, I mean, I'm fully in agreement with the law. I think justice has to be served. I am in full agreement with locking up all of them. Every perpetrator, I'm in agreement. I am in total agreement. And I think punishment can be a deterrent, right? That factor of them going to jail. Now, what happens in that prison? Can that person be rehabilitated? Is, I think, some of our next conversations, because I've seen it happen in different cases. So I know that it's not impossible. And I'm very fortunate to be rooted in having worked in Africa, which is my favorite continent in the world. It will always remain my favorite continent. And I've been really fortunate to have worked with amazing, amazing people. Like, for example, in the Great Lakes region, you know, they were not able to rebuild Rwanda after the genocide, you know, without doing things like having truth and reconciliation. Now, I know if it's done wrongly, it can actually worsen a situation, right? If it's done the right way, it can have the impact that we need. So just to say, I don't have all the answers. I'm not going to say that, yes, you know, perpetrators should have the opportunity and option to be rehabilitated and it will work in every single case. It probably won't. It probably won't. But what I would say, for like I'm not opposed to it. I think it's an area that we need to discuss and explore further. And what I would say to all survivors is focus on yourself, get the therapy you need, get the counseling that you need, and make sure that you are okay on your journey. That's number one. Thanks.
Can I just direct response? I mean, I want to say a couple of things, and that's one, as a survivor, I mean, I hear I think forgiveness, if that's where you are, that's great, but I don't think that's necessary for restorative justice. I absolutely don't. And I think each survivor has their own journey. And I don't think that we should force this narrative of forgiveness, because that doesn't work for everyone. And you get to be as fucking angry as you need to be around what has happened to you. And I'm saying, I know that's very strong language, but I'm saying it because I feel like There's a way that we have this, oh, I don't forgive, and you think of restorative justice as or truth and reconciliation is that it's going to be rooted in, it doesn't have to be rooted in forgiveness. It can be rooted in something else, which is accountability, which is saying that you've done something that has harmed not just me, but a whole community of people. You are participating in harm of me, my body, and all of what has brought me here, and how that will impact everyone around me. And I think that that's, for me, is a different approach around restorative justice, which I've seen work better. And I also want to say one other thing around restorative justice. It's hard. It's not easy to think through gender-based violence and child sexual abuse, sexual assault, murder, right? These are the hardest things. I think, you know, when we think of some of the critiques of the prison industrial system, right? The prison system, we know as it is, doesn't work, and it's a for-profit system in many parts of the world. And so I did a lot of anti-prison work and prison abolition work when I lived in the US, in Florida especially, because of what the system was, but also realizing that, you know, the throwing people in jail isn't going to make us safer. So to your point around, yeah, I mean, I think justice has to be served, and we have a serious problem of justice not happening and people being on remand. There's a whole problem with the prison system too that we can get into, that's a human rights issue. But in terms of this issue, because gender-based violence is so normalized, because issues around consent and sexual assault and like people assuming that they can own your body because you show up, right? Like this male, a very masculine and sexist view of women and women's bodies, I think creates all kinds of problems in that so-called justice system, where women who are, and people who are trying to get justice, aren't getting it. So there's so many layers to that too, and I wanted to kind of bring that up in response, because it's, you know, it's a big part of the problem in how we think about this work and ending gender-based violence.
Yeah, thanks, Angelique. I mean, I totally agree with what you just said. Yeah. I mean, and to one of the points that you made, actually, in Kinshasa, I was able to work with chef coutumiers who are tribal chiefs in African villages. And I think they represented a really interesting perspective. So it was not the legal justice system, right, as we know it, in terms of how a magistrate rules or how a judge rules, but it was actually these tribal chiefs, so society coming together in their own cultural way and holding perpetrators accountable socially through their cultural mechanisms, as opposed to through the law itself. And I think these are some of the other alternatives that we also need to look at. How can society hold perpetrators accountable? We've seen so many failures in the justice system to do so. Yeah.
I'm kind of speechless because I've been trying my best not to cry with both you and Angelique's words, because I think a lot of survivors, and if there are any more on the call, it's a battle between really trying to understand that path to forgiveness and what does forgiveness mean. And there have been a couple of times, like in the past, where I would have messaged one of my abusers to say that I forgive you, even though I did not, but I thought that was actually something to do to heal. And so the end result would be me feeling really awful because I didn't forgive and I'm not fine, but they're feeling, okay, good, I weight is off my shoulders. And so it's a difficult thing to navigate. But listening to both of you speak and understanding sometimes perpetrators can be within your family. And so it's, I recently found out that a half brother of mine, I didn't grow up with him, who's like, he's way older than I am, actually committed different sexual offenses against women. And it tore me up. It was around the same time of you know, what happened to Ashanti, and it was a really difficult time to navigate, because here I am doing this kind of work, and then someone who has like almost the same blood running through their veins as you has done things like this. And so I don't know if there are words of advice in case there's anyone else that's logged on to this call. How do you navigate something like that? Because there's guilt. There's a lot of guilt in me. And to really understand, how do you navigate something like that? How do you not feel guilty and really continue on the path of really trying to end gender-based violence? This question was not in the lineup, by the way. And sorry if I threw you a curveball, but it came up.
May I say something, Ashley?
Yes.
Really glad you just said that, because I'm thinking all the while, you know, people talk about forgiveness, but each person has their own journey and they have to go through it and find peace within themselves, because they're not responsible for the other person. They're not responsible. Sometimes the perpetrator, they never find them. So how you gonna forgive him? You know, how the state will deal with him? So you're taking responsibility for your self-care and your recovery is so important.
And just to say, Ashley, I'm glad you shared that. Thank you for sharing that. I think this is the reason why, you know, restorative justice is used for civil offenses mostly and not criminal offenses, right? And the other thing is for survivors on this call is forgiveness is not a word that we play with or that we use lightly. When I've seen restorative justice done well, it's taken decades in terms of clinical psychology, you know, to move a survivor from a situation where she doesn't want to exist. She doesn't want to be here to face another day. She's facing clinical depression because of what has happened to her. She can barely make it through, right? She has to first self-care. She has to first focus on herself, take care of herself. And if years and years later, after she's received the necessary treatment, that comes into play, then so it is. And if it doesn't, then so it is. And that's fine as well, right? So I think that's what I want to add here.
Yeah, I think, and thank you so much, everyone, for what you've shared and how we are being, I think we're being very unapologetic in this, and I didn't know it was gonna go here, so I'm grateful, although it's hard. This is a harder conversation to have than the one I thought we were going to have. So I do think that this is the work, right? Because when we talk about people who are perpetrators as if they're monsters, they're somebody else, they're people we don't know. That's actually not the case most of the time. They are in our families. It could be our brothers, our uncles, our fathers, grandfathers, cousins, siblings, and that, you know, step siblings. I mean, all of that stuff, it gets so difficult. And I think that's why when we talk about restorative justice or different ways to approach gender-based violence, it has to be a multifaceted approach. It has to be survivor-centered and focused, and it has to take into consideration what survivors want, and not all survivors want the same thing. So it's not like you're just going to have one survivor voice and they're going to pop and be like, yes, this is great. No, I mean, that's the other thing, and that's why it's a hard, as Asiya was talking about, sometimes it could be years, you know? And also healing is a process. You know, I started doing, you know, I was lucky to get some free therapy in university. And, you know, I came out of it and I was like, oh, you know, I'm great. I'm good. Keep it going, right? Everything's great. And then, you know, a year later, something happens, right? And then something else happens, or a family member gets in touch with you, and then something else happens. And you know, the other thing for survivors, and I think survivor empowerment, is figuring out ways to not, because we're shamed, right? We're shamed into silence. We're shamed into, why can't you just get over it? Isn't it that happened? What happened so long ago? You know? And so the other thing is being able to stand in what has happened and being able to express that, and for a community to hold space. And if community doesn't hold space, then sometimes it means you have to exit. And for me, I mean, in terms of family, I had to do some exiting. I had to leave different spaces. So there's always, you know, it's a journey. But sorry, my point is that that's the hard part of restorative justice work, is that the people who are perpetrators are not just strangers. They're not just, someone we don't know. And so then that makes it complicated when we highlight the stories of the stranger or the person who didn't know, or because then that's easier to point out as being, that is the gender-based violence we can get around and rally around. It's much harder to talk about when it is within our families, within somebody we know. But the situation that's happened recently with Ashanti and bystanders, people who had heard or knew, I think to me that was also troubling, because there's a way that, if we had been holding folks in the community accountable, if we had been, doing that kind of work, this kind of work that Asiya is talking about, and what Jacquie is talking about, what we've been talking about today, is that you start to transform. You prevent those forms of violence from happening. So we have to get at the root cause of the issues and create that deep, long-lasting transformation. And that's where I think, that's where the work is, the hard work.
Yeah, and I think, thanks so much for that, Angelique. I think they sort of say a village raises a child, right? So, I mean, a lot of times, especially in Indo-Caribbean settings, if a woman wants to leave, her mother, the Women's Health Survey showed that, the majority of survivors, they don't go to the police to report. They go to family and friends, specifically their mothers. And there's so many of my friends, who face domestic violence, and they go to their mothers, and what do their mothers say? Go back, try again, give him a chance. No. And I think that's where the idea of the community holding these perpetrators accountable can be even more life-changing and even more critical than a justice system that we know may sometimes take years. I think society, because at the end of the day, if you look at what many perpetrators want, they may want to fit into society. They may want to be looked upon as like, yes, I'm so and so, I have status, I have wealth, everybody respects me, and so if society says we know this person and they, we take necessary steps. And here I really would urge us to kind of go back and look at some of those more sort of traditional, like, African tribal justice systems, because, they're excellent at doing that, at society and a village, holding that space and holding perpetrators accountable.
Thank you so much for those responses, everyone. I definitely think this evening has been something that, really allowed us to kind of look deeper in a sense of really understanding the many, many ways that we as individuals can work together to heal and to also know how we can contribute to ending gender-based violence, and even when it exists in the home or when it's really close to you. So just moving on from that part of it, I'd like to ask Asiya, in your work as an individual and with your NGO, working to end gender-based violence, what would you say has been the biggest lesson that you've learned throughout this process?
I think the biggest thing I've learned, and thanks for that question, is just the resilience and courage of our survivors. I mean, I feel really, really blessed to be able to work with them every day, not the other way around. I think a lot of people look at me and they're like, oh, she's the girl who does so, right? But no, truly, they have taught me the meaning of courage. They have taught me the meaning of resilience and the meaning of strength. And so every time I feel like I can't do something, I can't achieve this, I just think of the ladies and I just, wow, I mean, remarkable women who have changed my life in more than one ways. And I think of them and their families and just, I mean, I've truly been able to see conflict transformed. And to me, there is nothing as beautiful. So I think for me, it's just been a great honor, probably the greatest privilege of my life, to work with our survivors and to impact that level of change. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Asiya. So much. And the work that conflict does, it's really something that's so necessary. And I'm just grateful that you're doing it, and grateful for the people around you that continue to push you and to stand with you in doing this work that's so important. Jacquie, what have you found to be the priority area or areas that we need to collectively focus on to make an impactful change?
You know, knowing that violence is a learned behavior, I would think that people have to really realize that children learn what they see. So the whole thing about using corporal punishment, not doing or giving good examples of conflict resolution. Like you're hearing all this hullabaloo about family life education, and some people don't want it to be taught to their children. Some people thinking if you teach family life education, you're teaching the children to have sex, and which is the furthest thing from the truth. We have to give children who are growing into big men and women skills so that they can navigate their life. We have made the link, a lot of people have made the link between corporal punishment and violence as an adult. Are we not realizing that if you don't use corporal punishment, you have a better society in the long run? I don't know. But my belief is if you can get conflict resolution in its most nitty-gritty form, would be a great impact. I think using men as prevention as well as solution and getting them out of their control and their privilege and the kind of control they have over women. If we can have men changing around that, I think there would be a great impact. We will have a freer, easier. I ain't saying there won't be any drama, because it must have drama. It must have a little psychedelic. But I think on the most part, on a broader sense, we will have a better society.
Thank you so much, Jacquie. Are there any panelists want to chime in there? So my final question for the afternoon, it's really trying to imagine how, what are our next steps together as human beings, if anyone is watching us this evening and they're experiencing gender-based violence, or they know someone that's experiencing gender-based violence, what is some advice that you would give to them?
Well, I'll start. And well, I think first of all, I would say that to someone who's experiencing gender-based violence to reach out to one person they know that they can talk to and share. I think probably the hardest thing is telling that, if you've told no one, is telling that first person and being able to talk about it. And, I think that figuring out who your support system is, who can be your support system in that time, I think that's the most important, because that is going to help whatever situation you are in to figure out how to get out of it. WMANTRA has just put out a survivor's handbook. which is available online, and we can put it in the link, and I'm sure that CIWiL has shared it on their page already. But that's also going to be printed, as I understand it, and it'll be put across the country in different medical spaces. But I do think that, you know, we want to make sure that you have the resources and support to get whatever you've decided you want to do, to get help. I think recognizing and admitting that you're in a position that you need help is probably, again, the hardest. Telling someone and then figuring out what you want to do and what you can do, and then finding the resources for support. And I think Asiya will talk about how important it is to have that, to know where you can go and how you can get support. And, you know, I just want to say too that we are all living in such difficult and challenging times, but we're all dealing with our thing. And so I just want to say to whoever is out there as a survivor that you deserve help, support, and you deserve to live a life that you are not being harmed, and that you've done nothing to deserve that. And so, you know, I think that's, for me, that's what I want to say. I want to say that we have survived, right? So many, we come from survivors, and our ancestors survived. And so you will, and you can, and we're here. Reach out to any of us. To look for that support, and we'll be there for you.
Thanks so much, Angelique. That was beautiful. So I would add to that, and I would build on that. The first thing I would say is trust yourself. Really trust yourself. If you feel that you're not safe, if you feel your children are not safe, even if the abuse is emotional and psychological, it may not be physical, trust what you are feeling, right? That's the first thing. The other thing I would echo is speak out. So Angelique mentioned find one person. You know, I agree. It's very difficult, and we know that oftentimes silence is used as a tool of oppression, right? And so the best way out is for you to speak out, whether it is you pick up the phone and you call 800-SAVE, whether it is that you reach out to support groups, you reach out to conflict women, you reach out to the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, etc. The key thing is that you speak out. Don't feel that you have to suffer in silence. And the other thing I want you to know tonight is you are not alone. You are not alone. I remember, you know, many times in our workshops, you know, we've welcomed survivors from all different stages, you know, some in shelters, some living in abusive relationships, etc. And many of them, when they walk into a workshop, you know, the first thing they would kind of say to me is, are all of these women survivors? You know, and then for them, that was a huge thing, because many people, you know, one of the things we know that perpetrators do is they isolate you from family, they isolate you from friends, they make sure you do not have a support network. So in addition to speaking out, find a support network, find people you can trust. They're kind people. You know, a close friend of mine, his grandmother had a saying, there will always be good people. And that's true. There are always good people who will support you and who will help you. All right. So trust yourself, speak out, and find your support network. Thanks.
Okay, so what I would want to add, and I really don't want to stir anything, but today's Friday. In many homes, Friday evening is a dreaded time. Friday evening, well, nowadays lockdown, they're not going to the clubs and to the rum shop. But for times, Friday evening, you could hear him coming from out the road. And you know, that is not the same man who comes home very good during the week. But when he get into the hours and he bend that corner, mama at home had to start to quiver because the whole unleashing of the violence is the next thing. I'm really sorry, but I really want to ask the people around, especially people in the communities. Before we had shelters and before we had places to walk in, we had the village Mako, and we had that person who will mobilize others to go in front of the house to say, yes, we know what you're doing. We have to build on that. We have to let the perpetrator know that what he's doing is not undercover, is not in silence. Everybody knows what's happening, and let us call him out on it. There is help to be gained. There are places that he can go for help. Let him or her go and get the help that is needed. We really need to. And the people who are surrounding the victims, put away your fear. I want to get into people's business, and I put away that fear, because your showing up could save a life. So I would really want to ask people to, you know, mobilize on the ground, where you have that same over the fence talk where you can help the person who is being violated. You can help her devise, if she wants to get out, devise a plan to get out. And don't say, but what you do to make him get on so? Because a lot of that happens. A lot happens where the woman is blamed and she's judged, and it's not her fault, because we don't ask the man what you did to hit, what caused you to hit, or why it is you can't stop hitting.
Jackie, yes. Thank you for that. Thank you. We need that speak out on that community level, and speaking out not against all forms of violence. When we see it happening to kids, when we see it happening to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, young people, if we see someone who's being treated differently because of how they express their gender, you know, I mean, I think that's the kind of response, that community response we need. And the same thing with how, you know, how migrants are treated. Like, if we have to be willing to speak out, I think, against all forms of violence, and that creates a different kind of community. It also allows us to rely and depend on each other, you know, when we figure out what those support systems are. Thank you so much for that, Jackie. That really, here, thank you.
Just give me that kind of way, man. Sorry.
Jackie, I'm feeling your pain all the way on the side. I know we're tech, whatever, but I can feel it like right here.
It's such an important thing to like transform that culture of minding your business, and you know, like peeping. You pull your curtains to watch the bacchanal happen, but you would not pick up your phone to make a report. And so many people have, you know, had to face the consequences of that. You know, death even with that report that happened a couple of weeks ago, where in Flagstaff, where neighbors said, well, this is something normal, you know, and they made no reports. And then the end result is another person dead. And even the officers that you go to report to, sometimes they're unsensitized. They ask really, really stupid questions. Like I heard of this recently, someone, you know, that the officer asked, so you horning him or something? And that's not a question that helps you. That's not a question that helps anything, because they would have already formed their ideas as to what is happening. And so they tell you, go home and sort it out. And so you have your family telling you to go ahead and sort it out. You have officers that's supposed to help you telling you to go ahead and sort it out. So where does that middle ground lie, where we finally move away from such a harmful culture and really, really, really look after each other. And so it's really, it starts from self first in transforming that culture, in doing away with the whole mind your business, INC, this doesn't concern me, that's a husband and wife thing. But really, really understand our role in ending gender-based violence, how we can transform things, even as bystanders, how important our role is to help ending that violence. And so this was really, really a rich and empowering conversation for survivors, and also for us who may have witnessed or are still witnessing gender-based violence in where we live and through our existence. And so thank you so much to our audience and to the panelists. But just to end on a high note, and this was not planned, but the last and final thing, what does a brighter future look like?
I think if you work on the young ones now,
Yeah,
you shouldn't have anything to fear. But working on the young ones, get into the young ones, because if we keep shielding them, they never understand what is happening, because they see it in the family, they see and they know something is wrong. So unless we have the young people understanding that this is not the way to go, let's break this kind of chain, let's break this continuum or whatever we want, this cycle, let's break it here. Although some people really make a conscious decision, look, I ain't doing that. But, you know, some people still, you find young people, where was I hearing today? Some people talking about where in school, the boys don't know about boundaries. They're not respecting boundaries of the girls. Where they learn that? Because they see what the older ones are doing. So we have to work with the young ones to let them know what is in them old grizzle grunters. That's not the way it should be. So let's try to make a better life for everybody. Let's do it differently. So yes, if it could happen.
Thanks, Jackie. You know, I've been talking and, you know, looking at this term that I made up, gender-based peace, right? So if we talk so much about gender-based violence, what does gender-based peace look like? And to be honest, I don't know that I have the answers for that question. But I remember at the IWD March, International Women's Day earlier this year, IGDS, Angelique, you all were doing some videos. And someone asked me, what is my vision? And I said that gender-based violence, you know, is something that we read in a history book, and that it no longer exists because all women and girls in this country are safe and they're protected. So that's my vision. I'm getting goosebumps while I even talk about it, but I have this very clear picture of it in my head, like a book, and you open it and you say, there was a time when this used to happen to women and girls. That was a long time ago.
Oh, for me, my vision of the future is one with decolonial healing justice. And I've been really thinking about this for years. And I've been developing this idea and this vision that is about healing. It's about how do we heal, not just for ourselves, but for our community, and that we take into account the injustices of the past to create something new, to create a new world. And I'm really guided by, Audre Lorde's work on just thinking about the political act of self-care and extending that to community care. And I think that's how we create change. When I think of the future, I also think about when Audre Lorde says, I'm not free. Well, any woman is unfree, even if her shackles are different from my own. And that is a guide for me, and that means we still have to show up and do this work. But the future for me is, I want to be able, and everyone to be able to live a life filled with dignity and freedom, and to live and love freely. and to do that with all of the consensual boundaries and justice and healing work. So I agree with Jacquie. Young people, they keep me hopeful. I'm, all of the young people that I feel very grateful to be in their lives, to see them grow up, and I am visioning a world filled with justice for them, for the climate, for each other, for our spaces, for our people.
May I do a shameless little plug again? I want to urge people to maybe Google or search, whichever way you do your thing, Angelique's TED Talk on this same self-healing. I was blown away, and I guarantee you'll find something in there that you could latch on to.
Oh, Jacquie, thank you. Thank you so much to me that you saw it and it moved you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing, what you think a brighter future would look like. I feel really hopeful. And of course, to be able to be led by you all, that you have done so much great work, so much inspiring work, and young people like me and other people that, around at the national chapter, at all of the other organizations. You all have definitely inspired us to, join the movement and help to transform the way that things are currently. And so on behalf of everyone at the national chapter, the audience that tuned in both on Zoom and via Facebook, and who will watch this in the future, because everyone needs to watch this, just to learn and share in community also. And so I want to thank you all so much from the very center of my being, for being here and sharing your knowledge and sharing your vulnerability and everything that you did with us this evening. It's a perfect way to end and wrap, the 6 years of activism, even though the work does not end. But thank you so, so much for being here.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you very much for having us.
We're being led by you. We're being led by young people, right? So that's how we change. We also have to switch around that idea. We're all leaders. We're all doing this together.
Yeah, definitely agree. Thank you all so much. Special thanks to CIWiLTT for this panel. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Happy holidays.
Yes.